program is brought to you by the Amherst County Museum and Historical Society in partnership with the Amherst County Public Schools and the Lancers Tech Club. Good morning and welcome to A Visit with Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, Jeff Taylor. Good day, Mr. Jefferson.
My pleasure, Mr. Taylor. My pleasure particularly to be in your company once more.
Well, thank you. We've spent many a day in conversing about the subjects of the day.
Many subjects throughout the years. Now be kind to me today.
Well, we will see.
You never can know or trust what a news writer is going to hurl at you.
Well, as everyone knows, you were the author of the Declaration of Independence. You were the third president of the United States
and please do not forget the founder of our University of Virginia.
Yes, the University of Virginia.
Well, we have to be precise and concise on this because I've heard talk that there's a curriculum in the southwest hills of Virginia. I believe they refer to themselves as tech.
Yeah,
tech.
And I believe they refer to your students as Cavalier.
Cavalier. Well, I certainly am not impartial to that. I think that's rather a favorable appellation, but not so hokey as one might think if you talk of the tech out west in the hills.
Well, you were also governor of Virginia, and you also visited Amherst on many occasions. You had many friendships here, and you traveled through Amherst many times on your way to Poplar Forest.
Yes, I did, and I had an inheritance here as well, twicely. An inheritance from my father and an inheritance from my father-in-law. The inheritance from my father was first. It was actually a royal grant that was given to my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson. This was back in the early 1750s, and I think it was a result of father having surveyed, along with his good friend Daniel Scott, what became Albemarle County. That was surveyed out of Goochland County about 1774. And therefore, I think as an honorarium, the Crown bestowed upon my father a particular grant of about 350 acres, which I came into inheriting that from my father's estate. My father passed away when he was only 49 years old, leaving my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. Now, I was the eldest son, so therefore under British law, a primo first genitor family, I would inherit all of my father's estate when I came to my majority, because when my father died, I was only 14 years old. So my majority was in 1764. That's when I was 21, and so I inherited that from my father. In what was then, of course, when father received it, Albemarle County, and then when Amherst was created in 1761, well, 3 years later, then my holdings were in Amherst County. Now, secondly, I mentioned I received a property from my father-in-law, my wife's father, Mr. John Wales. Now, he was an immigrant Englishman, came here as a young man, did very well, and upon his passing in May, that was 1773, then I inherited from him several thousand acres in Bedford County, let alone in Amherst County. In fact, that's where I inherited Poplar Forest from my father-in-law. Good 4,000 acres in Tomahawk Plantation. And then in Amherst County, I received a great deal of land as well.
But you inherited a lot more than just land.
No, you're correct, Mr. Taylor. I inherited quite a number of families. I think you know of what I'm referring to. I've inherited a number of families from my father and my mother's estate as well. And of course, we know those are the families enslaved. And from my youth, I've never been in favor of it. That is well known. But unfortunately, it continues. And as I grow the deeper in debt, there appears to be no immediate recourse that is going to allow for an emancipation. History will be hard on me, and it has every right to be.
But you traveled with several of your enslaved people, didn't you?
Oh yes, frequently growing up. It was customary that the eldest son in the estate of a landed owner, that means a freeholder, you own directly your father's estate or your own estate, you have the privilege of voting and to be heard in public office and elected to public office. And so therefore it was customary that the eldest son would be granted the eldest son in an enslaved family. And so I grew up with Jupiter. Jupiter and I traveled together quite frequently. In fact, when I set out to William and Mary, I was not yet 17 years of age when I traveled out to Williamsburg, 120 miles from Charlottesville. That was the winter of '59 and '60. Jupiter accompanied me and continued to accompany me on those travels out to Williamsburg and back, no less than 5 days in the saddle. And I can only say we had the most enjoyable and invigorating conversation upon all subjects. And the liberty, the future liberty of those enslaved was certainly not the least of them.
But he was an excellent competitor in a certain board game that you played, wasn't he?
That is correct, Mr. Taylor. If you are referring to the number of times that Jupiter may have bested me in the game of chess, we do not have to proceed then from this point.
Understand. So you visited Amherst County the first time going to see Poplar Forest. You remember the second visit?
The second time was never to be forgotten. That was Monday, June the 4th, 1781. Why do I know precisely the day and year? Because it was election day. The election was being held in Charlottesville because the Virginia House of Delegates had retreated from Richmond. This was during the war, and we were worried that the British would sail up the James or the York River, lay siege to Richmond. This was our worry when our government was still in Williamsburg. That's the reason why we moved the government from Williamsburg to Richmond. I presided over that as the second elected governor of our Commonwealth. But then hearing word that the British would proceed farther up the James River, we retreated from Richmond to Charlottesville. Oh, and I was never, ever the more happy on that Monday morning when all of us sat down to breakfast at Monticello. And when I say all of us, I mean not only members of the Virginia House of Delegates, the Governor's Council, but also General Nelson himself, Thomas Nelson, a signer of our declaration, whom we knew would be elected that day the third governor of our Commonwealth. I had spent 2 years, two of the least favorable years as I look back in my entire life. Suddenly, there came a tap upon the window pane when we were about the breakfast table. We looked out, and here was the blooded physiognomy of this young boy. I recognized him immediately. He was the son of the tavern keeper who held the tavern then in Cuckoo, Virginia. The father was John Jewett the elder, and this was his son, Jack Jewett, the younger. John later went on to own the Swan Tavern in Charlottesville, right across from the courthouse. But we could not understand why he was so excitable, and we welcomed him in, and here he told us the evening before, in his father's tavern in Cuckoo, that he overheard British dragoons who were under the command of, what was his name? McLeod was the name of the dragoon commander, to pursue orders of Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton to seek the capture of Governor Jefferson as well as many members of the Virginia House of Delegates they could find in Charlottesville. So thank heaven that young Jack Jewett jumped upon his steed and rode over 40 miles that evening. 40 miles through the thickets and the forest and the woods of Virginia in order to alert us, inform us that the British dragoons were on their way. It is said that I took my time as I first busied to get my family in a carriage and send them off to Amherst County, particularly to send them down to Hugh Geddes' plantation.
Hugh Rose?
Hugh Rose's plantation,
correct,
known as
yes.
Geddes.
Right.
Geddes. And of course, that is the name of the little village, it is said, in Wales, where the Rose family originally was seated. So they were all set off to travel down to Geddes' plantation, and it is said that I busied myself bearing some of the state papers beneath the floorboards of the dining room at Monticello. And then Matthew Hemmings, the Hemmings family, encouraged me to quickly set off, and I said, well, Matthew, you must come along with me. He said, no, I'm going to stay right here. I said, no, you cannot suffer yourself to have harm come to you or anyone else. Come with me. He said, no, I am going to stay here at Monticello. So, worried about what would transpire, I rode up to Mount Alto, a short distance to the west of Monticello. And I got off my horse to look back at Monticello through my spyglass. But as I was kneeling down on the ground, my sword got in the way. Many people do not realize I was commissioned a colonel of Virginia militia during the American Revolution. Not that I saw any action, except for this day. But my sword got in the way. So I unhooked my sword, put it down on the ground, and then knelt down to look through my glass. I didn't see any of the green coats. You know, the British Dragoons at that time were known for wearing very short green jackets and then big bear hats. And I didn't see any of them corralling around the top of my mountain, so I thought, well, perhaps they heard that I had left, the family had gone, and they were heading straight to Charlottesville. So I thought, I better ride to Charlottesville and provide a forewarning, as young Jewett had gone forth to do earlier. So I jumped on my horse to ride off. I had taken but several paces and realized I forgot my sword. So I rode back and dismounted, went to pick up my sword, looked out to the mountain, thought I saw some smoke, brought up my spyglass, and within those few moments, the mountaintop was swarming with green coats. There they were, setting fire to my barns, to my crops. They were slaughtering my livestock. Oh, and I waited. What would they do? When would they torch the mansion house? And I could see Matthew Hemmings walk out on the west portico. And I saw one of the dragoons jump from his horse, went up, and there appeared to be some conversation between them. I then watched as Matthew Hemmings turned, went back into the house, and I saw all of the green coats dismount, and all of them followed up through that west portico into the parlor of Monticello. I wondered whether Matthew had invited them to breakfast. So I thought, well, I better set off. So I hooked my sword and jumped my steed and ran off to Charlottesville. I did not know until actually many months later that the dragoon who jumped off his horse was McLeod himself, the commander himself. And he went up and addressed Matthew Hemmings, "Where is your master? Where is your master? The governor of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson." And Matthew would not answer. And so he drew forth his pistol and said, "You tell me where your master is, or I will dispatch a fatal wound." And Matthew pulled his coat aside and said, "Fire away."
Wow.
He didn't. He brought down his pistol, and he invited all of his fellow dragoons to come into the mansion house, where he said, "Jefferson has, I understand, the finest stocked wine cellar of anyone I've known." So that's what they were doing. But that was the extraordinary heroism of Matthew Hemmings. And, if you will, I then, after riding to Charlottesville and understanding that the delegates had taken leave, they all went farther on a retreat to Stanton. I then rode down to Geddes to be with my family, but only one day, because then I rode back to Stanton to see that all was there in order, and they did then, at the end of that week, elect General Nelson as the third governor of our Commonwealth of Virginia. And as we all know, we were finally saved in our protection and defense, because several months later we all witnessed the victory far east at Yorktown.
True.
So
how long did you stay, or your family stay at Geddes?
we were there about a month, and then we went down farther south to Poplar Forest. And that's where we stayed the entire rest of first part of July and through the summertime.
Now, you also were friends with the Ruckers of Amherst County, particularly Benjamin and
Anthony Ruckers, yes. They were quite a prosperous family that had come to settle in the vicinage of where Mr. Lynch had conducted a ferry across the Upper James. And they were renowned for creating a particular flat-bottomed boat of great length, well over, upwards of about 70, near 100 feet long.
Well, it was more like 40 to 50 or 60 feet.
Well, I will tell you one thing, nothing of its length had ever been seen on the James River before that. And if I'm correct when I say flat bottom, the flat bottom was about 4 feet in width, but then it rose up on the sides to be 6 feet across on the top. Now, what the Ruckers invented was something that would make the transportation of hogsheads of tobacco A hogshead being a large barrel, extremely large barrel, into which you could pack sufficiently 1,000 pounds of tobacco. And I think these long bateaux carried upwards of about 6 or 7, maybe more than that.
Even up to 11.
11 of these.
Two stacks.
2 stacks. Now, where the Rucker's genius was exemplified is the fact that down the James River there are many occasions in which the waters are wont to play tricks with you on the current. So what that flat bottom bateau would allow you is the boat with proper helmsmen at each end to actually maneuver better that turn in the current that might be unexpected in order to keep then farther directly down the river. Now, I will tell you what I think is interesting. Many people might not realize this, but the conduit of our waterways was so essential to the farther migration of population westward, because so many of the rivers and waterways, the confluences of rivers into the James River, were encumbered with falls and shallow areas. I often have wondered whether the world was better off simply because I have lived, and happily, one of the very first achievements was to be able to dredge the upper Rivanna to make it the more navigable, particularly for bateaux, all the way to Charlottesville. It was unable to have that navigation before that time. So when I was a young man, I achieved that, and these bateaux that were invented, they truly were invented by the Rucker brothers there in Lynchburg, made it more easily navigable to carry more hogsheads down the James.
Now, you watched the first launching, I believe, and wrote about it in your book.
That is correct. I made a notation. It was back this was before the Revolution. Well, no, the conflict had begun. The conflict began in 75. This is before the Declaration was written and before we announced our independence or voted for independence. It was 75. It was in the summer of 75, 1775.
April 19th.
Oh, they are, April 19th. So you have to watch out for these news writers. They know more precisely the answers to the questions they're asking you than you may know, particularly as you get older. I think it was the spring of 75. And I came to Mr. Lynch's ferry, and I watched one of these bateau launches and was quite taken with it, quite the act of ingenuity, so much so that many years later when it was contested, the Ruckers wanting to achieve a patent for it, I bore witness that I had entered a description in my memorandum books that would validate them being the first to invent this bateau.
Anthony Rucker was the tobacco inspector for the county at the time, and I think he saw this as a way to better get the cargo down to Richmond. Mm-hmm. But the boats carried more than just tobacco. They carried brandy wine and lumber and coal and iron ore and several other things. They were very good at maneuvering in the river. And Benjamin had his saw pits where he cut the lumber.
It was a true feat of engineering. And what is most wonderful about it is we proved ourselves thereby an inheritor of an ancient design. Bateaux, of course, were known by the French. That's why it has a French name, bateau, for sailing down, maneuvering down waterways of the Kingdom of France and other European kingdoms, but never to the length and never to the capacity of what it might carry. Than what we were able to create ourselves. But that's why we're renowned, are we not, as a nation, for going far beyond whatever may be created in the kingdoms of Europe to try and achieve that better for the support of our growing population.
True, very true. To change the subject a little bit, this topic is on the minds of many people right now, and that's epidemics and pandemics. You had suffered or seen suffering of lots of things: smallpox, yellow fever, a lot of maladies of the day. And you believed that cities were basically breeding grounds for not only economic and political dependency, but as you wrote, the mobs of great cities were hothouses for infectious diseases because of the density of urban population and the frequency of inadvertent human contact. I think you thought that and knew that diseases spread less efficiently in rural areas, and you thought that was an extremely important situation, that people should not be piled upon people in urban areas. Smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, tuberculosis, measles, dysentery, whooping cough. It was actually estimated that 90% of the casualties that George Washington's army during the Revolution were due to disease and not through fighting. And he asked that people be inoculated, and you actually were inoculated for smallpox. Is that correct?
That is correct. Smallpox came through our early settlements for decades with a vengeance. It would return. And when you talk about the element of infecting one with smallpox, never let it be forgotten. During the war, during the American Revolution, the British were often infecting not only our troops, but even the enslaved. And so therefore, we realized that unless we have some proper vaccination that would prohibit us from ever succumbing to that disease, there must be another way in order to provide some prohibition to it. And so that other way was known as inoculation. Now, it's rather a barbarous process because they would simply, well, I don't know whether it be so delicate to explain here to anyone, but they would sew the pox of a cow into your arm. And so it was an element of fighting fire with fire in essence. But unfortunately, it killed off far too many than it was known to cure. Now, if your family had the means, well, then you could go up to a place like Philadelphia, and granted a city, but then Philadelphia, not only the center of commerce, was also the center of education, enlightenment, and medicine. So you had the finest educated doctors of medicine in Philadelphia. And it was, let me see now, I believe it was Dr. Morgan, Edward Morgan, or it could have been Dr. Shippen, I don't remember. They were both esteemed doctors in Philadelphia City. I was only 23 years old. This is the first time that I left my native woods and fields to go forth to what was the largest city in North America at the time. Philadelphia City, upwards at that time, I believe, of about 40,000 souls. And so I was inoculated there, and of course you suffer, you come down with the disease for at least 2 weeks, but because your body is strong enough to be able to thwart it and fight it, then presumably inoculated by a well-tested doctor, you will survive. Unfortunately, I did. Now, it was years later when an Englishman, Dr. Jenner, Edward Jenner, came up with a vaccine. Finally, he came up with a vaccine. And I remember, of course, it was all in the newspapers that many Englishmen and many others were clouded with a superstition to allow themselves to be vaccinated. They thought away from it, but not me. 3 years later, when I was inaugurated the president of our new nation, I promoted the vaccination through our nation. And as I have written, I vaccinated 70 to 80 of my families. Now, those were the families that we were referring to a short time earlier.
The enslaved families.
The enslaved families. I personally vaccinated these families. It was a great inroad. Now, here's another pestilence that came through, for which we still, in my knowledge, have absolutely no answer to as to where it emanates, where it comes from, or how we might cure ourselves from it. It's called the yellow fever.
1793 in Philadelphia.
It was awful. I will tell you that we had no idea where it came from. Some thought that it was coming from coffee that was being imported from the Central American countries, barrels that were allowed to stand on the wharfs of Philadelphia City for some time, and allowing the coffee to become somewhat rancid. Some say even that the water from rain that accumulated on the tops of the barrels would then become stagnant and stale and seep into the coffee. No idea, but what we did know is during that autumn of 1793, in that city, again, about 40,000 people, 5,000 died from the yellow fever in only 3 months.
And this, at the time, was the United States Capitol.
Yes.
The U.S. Capitol had not been built. It was under construction.
It was under construction. You're absolutely right. The Congress passed a bill that we would have our government remain in Philadelphia for 10 years while we were building the new Capitol along the banks of the Potomac, becoming, of course, Washington City. Do you know the yellow fever was so bad that the government went into quarantine? We moved several miles to the northwest of Philadelphia to the village of Germantown, and I'll tell you, excuse me here, let me see.
You have your quarantine mask
I was
with
just
you?
going to say,
Yes.
we wrapped up. We wrapped up in Germantown. We wrapped up just like this because we had no idea where it was coming from. We had no idea how you might infect one or the other. And, we almost lost our Secretary of the Treasury. He came down with yellow fever, but because he had it as a young boy growing up in the Indies, well, he survived. But that's been so long ago, I doubt anyone remembers who our Secretary of the Treasury was so long ago.
Let's see.
You wouldn't remember
Should
him.
I hazard a guess?
You can hazard all the guesses you want to. He's easily forgotten.
Mr. Hamilton?
We don't need to hear the name another time.
Okay. Well, part of your presidency was moving west. Was this a part of the theory of why people should move to open spaces that were rural and spread out?
Yes, I can tell you distinctly that in Virginia, not only are you continually seeking virgin soil, and by that I mean the opportunity to cultivate what many still consider to be the first and foremost cash crop, tobacco, in virgin soil, because as you may know, tobacco easily kills the soil. It's very hard on the soil. And so you're always, while you're planting fields of tobacco, lumbering another acre or two in order to continue to cultivate in virgin soil. You only have a lucrative return for about 15, 16 years before that revenue begins to wane. But the continual migration westward to higher altitudes, to venture up into the mountains and then into valleys along the western ends, provides, in my opinion, and I've written so, a healthier climb than what we have suffered in the tidewater of Virginia for so many generations, let alone the eastern lands of our continent, of our East Coast. And yes, what you have recited that I wrote about the pestilence that is conducive to living in cities when we pile ourselves one upon the other has a lot to do for helping people to seek out healthier climes to the west.
So moving west of the Appalachians, so to speak, and acquiring the Louisiana Purchase and all those areas, not just was for economics, it was also for the well-being of the populace.
Yes, without a question, yes. And unfortunately, I've never had the opportunity to venture west and inspect it myself. I have never been west of the pools. I've never been west of the hot springs, the warm springs here in Virginia. I've never been south of the Virginia-Carolina line. And my uncle, Field Jefferson, my father's brother, operated a ferry along the Roanoke River. He had several sons, and they continued to do that, but you would think I'd go visiting with my paternal relations, but no, I've never been down to the Roanoke River. Now, I have been as far north as Portsmouth in New Hampshire. Never been across the York River to Maine, however.
But you did send a corps to venture and explore the West, and they brought back many things that you had at the White House, or the President's house, I should say.
Yes, many people keep calling it the White House, and I'm presuming that since the British burned it, that its reconstruction has also allowed it to be painted white. They tell me there are a great number of scorch marks over top of the doorways and the windows that need to be hidden for the future. But you're correct. A lot of the curiosities and the relics that were sent back to me from the far west travels of Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant Clark, I then hung on the walls of the entrance hall in the President's house, the most curious antler forms of antlers you'd ever seen. and pelts of animals never seen before by the eye of man east of the Appalachian Mountains. And now, of course, in retirement, as I've come back home to Charlottesville, I brought much of this to hang on the entrance hall at Monticello.
But I understand you have a buffalo skin robe that you greet visitors at your home?
There have been occasions in which that's the Mandan Sachem robe. In other words, a great buffalo robe that was made into somewhat of a cape worn by the chieftain of the Mandan tribes, and decorated on the inside, the skin side of that robe, with the victories, little figures of the natives in conflict and battle amongst themselves, where, of course, the Mandan tribe had proved to be victorious in that conflict. So the robe is worn as an honorarium. And yes, that was acquired by Captain Lewis, and he did send that back to me. And when I am not wearing it, I have it hanged over the mezzanine railing there as you come into the entrance hall, and it's rather effective.
You had many famous friends who also suffered through some illnesses. Dolly Payne Todd, do you remember her?
Oh, mercy, yes, of course I remember. She's still living, but I remember what you are referring to. That was during the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. She was married to a Quaker gentleman at the time, John Todd. Now, she was a Payne, of course. She was born a Payne, her family from North Carolina. But she married a very successful attorney. They went up to Philadelphia to live, John Todd. They had a little boy, John Todd the Younger, and it was during that yellow fever in Philadelphia, the autumn of 1793, that she lost both her husband and her boy, and was a widow for a few years. I wouldn't say too very long, before she was introduced to a gentleman.
A friend of yours?
A dear friend of mine. They were introduced. It was in the Gray's Ferry Tavern. Gray's Ferry Tavern. It was on the west bank of the Schuylkill River there in Philadelphia. That's how you normally came into Philadelphia if you were coming up from Virginia or the southwest counties of Delaware and Pennsylvania. You take the ferry across the Schuylkill River into Philadelphia. And I'm hesitant to even make statement, but do you know who introduced the widow Todd and Mr. James Madison, my friend?
Another friend of yours?
Well, I'm not going to say that much. It was Colonel Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr introduced them at Gray's Ferry Tavern.
The infamous Burr.
Well, maybe that was the only thing he did for which he could receive any fame.
So she married and became Dolly Madison.
She became Dolly Madison, Jemmy's dear wife. They live about a day's ride to the northwest from Monticello at Montpelier, and they come a-visiting frequently. They have their own room at Monticello where I welcome them to stay.
And she occasionally served ice cream in your White House?
Well, she did. When I was in the president's house, she would serve a particular recipe of iced cream, which included, when I say particular recipe, it included a flavoring, a savory, that I brought back from my years in France, the vanilla bean. And Mrs. Madison certainly favors that flavor for ice cream. Do you know what the favorite flavor for ice cream was before I delighted our nation with the introduction of the vanilla bean? Any idea?
I have no idea.
Well, Mrs. Madison could tell you. That's why she was so ready to accept the vanilla bean. It was oyster.
Oyster?
Oyster ice cream.
Oyster ice cream, huh?
Now think about that.
Sounds so unbecoming.
Well, but it congeals together. It does make for an interesting flavoring. I'm certainly more partial to the vanilla bean.
But Ms. Madison was sometimes called the lady of the president's house when you were there. That was because you had lost your wife to illness, is that correct? And you had many children who died from illnesses.
Oh my. Mrs. Jefferson, well, we were only married for 10 years, and we could never understand why childbirth compromised her health. She craved sugar more than usual during childbirth, and our babies weighed heavier consecutively. She produced 6 children during those 10 years, and we could never understand why it was such a distress for her. And our last child, a little girl, Lucy Elizabeth, weighed nearly 12 pounds. Mrs. Jefferson did not survive, but not before I promised her I would never marry again, and I don't know whether many people realize, but I've held to that promise, and she did not have to continue to live and suffer, as I did, the death of 5 of our 6 children, most of them while youngin'. And I can't tell you any more than conflicts of a simple fever. Now, one little baby had what we came to discern was whooping cough, but no, the others, even my dear daughter, Mrs. Epps, Mary, or Polly as I affectionately referred to her, though she did marry, and she had 3 children, only one of whom lived to adulthood. She herself died shortly after childbirth. She was only 24.
So you loved Mrs. Jefferson very dearly. As a matter of fact, I understand that when you were courting her, sometimes you performed on an instrument.
Well, she was, now I'll tell you first and foremost, I first met Miss Martha Wales. I mentioned earlier in our discourse, she was the eldest of the 4 daughters of Mr. John Wales. They all lived in Charles City County at a plantation known as the Forest, and extensive holdings. I mentioned that Mr. Wales had done very well, not only in acquiring a great deal of land, but also in the practice of law. And I first met her in Williamsburg as some of the social gatherings they would hold there at the Old Royal College, and she was quite proficient upon the spinet, magnificent artistry upon the spinet. And well, what can I say at that time, but simply I stood in line. She had many suitors, and she finally accepted the hand of a classmate of mine of William and Mary, Bathurst Skelton, and they were only married for 2 years. Bat was killed in a carriage accident near Williamsburg, and I don't know whether you recall, but at the time it was customary for a widow to go into a formal period of mourning. 2 years. She would sequester herself close to her family, could not attend any social functions, go out to attend any society gatherings. Can you imagine being sequestered so close to your family for that length of time? Well, she came to welcome my courtship, though it did not happen overnight. I was riding down the Duke of Gloucester Street in Williamsburg, and I heard the most melodious sound of a spinet coming out of a parlor window. Well, I recognized that melody. In fact, so did my horse. He perked up his ears, took me swiftly in the direction of the porch to the house, and when I got there, I dismounted, went up to the porch, and there was the elegant form of the widow Skelton seated at the spinet. Well, I knew then she must be coming out of her seclusion, so I made a rap on the door, and the servant girl approached, and I asked her whether the widow Skelton would enjoy Mr. Jefferson to accompany her on his kit. Well, the servant girl said just a moment. She went in, returned to the affirmative. The widow Skelton would be delighted for your accompaniment. So I ran to my horse satchel and I snatched my kit. Mr. Taylor, now certainly you have yourself a lengthy history of courtship, so you must know exactly what a kit is.
I'm going to hazard a guess that it's a stringed instrument.
It is a stringed instrument. It's a miniature violin. It's only about that long, half the size in its width, and it's what the music masters would carry about in their pockets when they go around to teach music and dance. And of course, well, that's one of the greatest virtues. You would know that, you see. You can carry it in your pocket, so it's always ready for those immediate moments of romance. So I brought in my kit, and the two of us, Widow Skelton and myself, had an hour's musicale, and it was certain, as we adjourned, that she had accepted my courtship. Well, I'll never forget when I was taking leave, the same servant girl handed me my hat and said, Mr. Jefferson, you might be delighted to know that during your musicale, I was looking out the window and I saw 2 gentlemen riding up towards this porch when suddenly the ears of the horses perked up. This is at the time that the widow Skelton was proceeding further in a solo, and they both arrived at the porch quickly. They both dismounted, ran up to the door, ready to knock at the same time. When it was then, the music of your kit was heard conjoined with the music of the spinet, and the one gentleman looked to the other, lowered his hand, and said, "We're too late. Jefferson's gotten here before us." That's a true story, Mr. Taylor. That's a true story. Word for word, a true story. Now, if you're going to relate that in the press, you make certain that that is exactly word for word as I spoke it.
I will also relate that you love your wife very much, and you missed her very much after she passed.
I rarely, this is a rare occasion that I should bring her up in discussion, but I think anyone who has been so deeply attached to another would vouchsafe the same. You never forget.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, on that note, I would like to thank you for coming to Amherst and having this discussion with us today. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope everybody who is with us will enjoy it as well. Thank you, sir.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Taylor, and I thank all of you. I look forward to making your acquaintance someday when we can all be together and have an enjoyable conversation together. Is not the art of conversation as much, if not more, than the art of music or the art of painting, the art of sculpture? And when you think that we all live here in the wilderness, and what a beautiful garden wilderness it is, well, we only have one and the other. And so never let us underestimate the art of conversation.
And maybe this will spur more people to have conversations about wonderful things, about beautiful things, but about difficult subjects as well.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's the only way we can achieve any less difficult efforts, is when we talk about it and discuss it. And therefore we can continue to ameliorate differences and move forward together. And that's what brought 13 individual nations together, did it not? E pluribus unum.
That's exactly right. Thank you so very much. We hope you'll enjoy this conversation and this discussion, and we hope you'll join us again for many more. Thank you. This program was brought to you by the Amherst County Museum and Historical Society in partnership with the Amherst County Public Schools and the Amherst Lancers Tech Club.